The night was colder than Sarah Helene had ever felt before. The wind came in sharp waves, cutting through the thin fabric of her shawl. Her bare feet pressed into the icy ground, sending sharp pain through her legs with every step. The alien city was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavy and unfriendly. Tall glass towers glowed with pale neon light, their windows warm and golden inside. But not for her, not for a widow like her. Her people did not welcome her anymore. Once, she had a home, a husband, and a warm bed for her little son. But when her husband died during the border raids, the elders came to her door and took everything. They said it was tradition. They said a widow was bad luck and should be cast out so misfortune would not spread. Her small son Laro clung to her skirt, his teeth chattering in the cold. She wrapped her arms around him, trying to block the wind. Every breath turned into a cloud of frost between them. Her eyes scanned the street, looking for anyone who might open their door. She walked to the nearest house, a round silver structure with warm smoke curling from its vent. She knocked. Softly at first, then harder. A shadow appeared behind the frosted glass. The door opened just a crack, and a narrow-eyed woman looked out. When she saw Sarah Helene, her face twisted. "Go away," the woman hissed. "We don't take in your kind." The door shut in her face with a sharp click. She moved to the next house, her knuckles turned red as she knocked. A man answered this time, tall, wearing a thick fur coat. She bowed her head and spoke in a shaking voice. "Please. My son is cold. We have no shelter. We just need one night." The man frowned and looked past her, as if expecting to see someone else. When he saw only the small boy at her side, he shook his head. "Find somewhere else, widow, before the guards see you begging." The door slammed, and the sound echoed in her chest. Laro coughed. It was a small cough at first, but then it became rough, scraping through his tiny throat. Fear gripped her heart. The cold here was not just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Deadly. She pulled him close again and kept walking. The streets were getting emptier, the neon signs flickering above her head. She passed a group of young alien men who leaned against a wall. They stared at her with cruel amusement, whispering to each other. One of them laughed loudly. "Look. The cursed widow is still alive." She quickened her pace. Not looking back, her legs were numb, her fingers had no feeling. But she could not stop. Then, as she turned into an old side street, she saw movement in the shadows. A tall figure stood there, broad shoulders outlined by the faint orange glow of a street lamp. The figure stepped forward, and her heart tightened. This was not one of her people. His skin was a pale brown tone, his hair dark, his clothes strange and worn. A human. Humans were rare here. Most had left the planet years ago after trade agreements collapsed. What was he doing in this part of the city, at this time of night? He was carrying a small crate under one arm. But when he saw her and Laro, he stopped walking. His eyes swept over her torn shawl, the boy's trembling hands and the bluish color of their lips. He frowned. "Where's your home?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Sarah Helene swallowed hard. "We have no home," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. The human looked at Laro, who stared back with wide, tired eyes. The man stepped closer, and Sarah Helene tensed, not knowing if he was dangerous. He set his crate down and shrugged off his heavy coat. Before she could speak, he knelt and wrapped it around Laro, tucking it tight. The warmth made the boy sigh softly, leaning into it. Sarah Helene felt a rush of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. "You can't stay out here," the man said, straightening up. "There's no one else who will let us in," she said, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. He studied her for a moment, then turned and jerked his head toward the far end of the street. "Come with me," he said simply. She hesitated. Glancing back at the empty road, she knew nothing about this human. He could be kind, or he could be just another danger. But the cold was already stealing the strength from her legs and her son. He would not survive the night out here, so she followed. The man led them through narrow alleys lit by broken lamps. They stopped in front of an old cargo shelter. Its metal door rusted and dented. He pushed it open, the hinges groaning loudly. Inside was a single dim heater, a stack of blankets, and the faint smell of engine oil. It was not much, but to Sarah Helene, it looked like safety. He placed the crate on the floor and motioned to the heater. "Sit there, warm up," he said. She guided Laro over and sat close, feeling the heat touch her skin. The man disappeared for a moment and came back with a dented pot. "Soup," he said, pouring it into small metal bowls. She took hers slowly, the steam rising into her face. For the first time in years, her fingers began to feel warm again. She did not know this man's name. She did not know why he helped her. But in this cold, endless night, he was the only warmth she had. The human's shelter was not like the warm homes Sarah Lynn remembered from her past. It was small, made of dented metal sheets, and the corners were stacked with crates and tools. The heater made a faint humming sound, and the orange glow from its coils painted the walls in soft light. Sarah Lynn sat close to it with Laro, watching the human as he moved around the room. He didn't look at them much, only checking the pot on the small cooking unit and adjusting the heat. The smell of soup grew stronger, mixing with the faint scent of oil and metal. Her son's eyes followed the human with quiet curiosity, but Sarah Helene stayed tense, ready to take her child and run if she needed to. When the man finally spoke again, his voice was calm. "Eat while it's hot," he said. Setting the steaming bowls in front of them, Laro grabbed his quickly, blowing on the surface before sipping. Sarah Helene held hers but didn't eat right away, the human noticed, and frowned slightly. "You don't trust me," he said. Not as a question but as a fact. She looked down. "It's not easy to trust anyone here," she replied. He nodded slowly, as if he understood. "I'm Ethan," he said after a pause. "Sarah Helene," she answered softly. "And this is Laro." The boy gave a small wave before going back to eating. Ethan's eyes rested on the child for a moment, and something softened in his expression. "You've been on the streets long?" he asked. "Too long," she said, the words heavy in her mouth. Her mind replayed the nights under broken roofs, the days without food, the cold that never went away. She had stopped counting the weeks, maybe because counting would make it harder to survive. Ethan didn't ask more. Instead, he sat on an old chair and began to fix something, a small device with blinking lights. The sharp sound of metal tools clicking together filled the quiet space. Laro's eyes lit up with interest, watching Ethan's hands move quickly and skillfully. Sarah Helene noticed and smiled faintly. Her son had always been curious, but life on the streets had left him with nothing to explore. For the first time in a long while, Laro looked like a child again, not just a survivor. After they finished the soup, Ethan pulled out a folded blanket and handed it to her. "Wrap him up and let him sleep," he said. She hesitated, still unsure of his intentions, but the blanket was thick and warm, and when she wrapped it around Laro, the boy relaxed instantly, his breathing slowing. Within minutes, he was asleep against her side. She looked at Ethan. "Why are you helping us?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. He didn't look up from the device he was working on. "Because no one else will," he replied simply. She didn't know how to respond on her planet. Kindness always came with a price. She wondered what his price would be. Maybe he wanted labor, maybe food, maybe something worse. But for now, her child was warm, and that was enough. Outside, the wind howled through the empty streets, rattling the loose panels of the shelter. Ethan set down his tools and stood, walking to the small window. He peered out, his shoulders tense. "What is it?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. Finally he said, "People here don't like outsiders. And I'm not just talking about humans." She understood instantly. He meant her too. She lowered her gaze, feeling the familiar sting of rejection. But his next words caught her off guard. "Doesn't matter, I'm not throwing you back out there." It was the first time in years someone had chosen her side without hesitation. For a moment, she almost felt safe. Almost later that night, Ethan sat at a small desk, scribbling notes on a worn datapad. She watched him from her corner, wondering what kind of life he had. He seemed alone. No other humans came to this planet anymore, unless they had to. Maybe he was running from something. Too, she thought about asking, but decided not to, instead. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself and her son, letting the steady hum of the heater lull her toward sleep. But she didn't sleep deeply. Every sound made her eyes snap open. The creak of the walls, the distant footsteps outside. At one point, Ethan rose quietly and moved toward the door. She sat up instantly. "Where are you going?" He looked back, his face half in shadow. "Checking something," he said. He opened the door just enough to step outside, and cold air rushed in. When he returned, his jaw was tight. "Someone's been hanging around out there," he muttered. Her stomach turned. She knew what that meant. Word was spreading, and not in a good way. Ethan locked the door with a heavy metal bar and turned back to her. "Get some rest," he said. She wanted to ask if they were in danger, but his tone told her enough. Danger was always close in this city. Tonight, it just felt closer than ever. In the corner, Laro shifted in his sleep, mumbling something softly. Sarah Helene stroked his hair. She glanced at Ethan, who was already back at his desk, working on the blinking device again. The orange glow of the heater lit his face, making him look both tired and determined. She didn't know why this human had chosen to help her, but she knew that if he hadn't, she and her son might not have survived. The night, and as the cold wind roared outside, Sarah Lynn realized something else. This stranger was the only warmth left in her world. Morning came slowly in the alien city. The pale light of dawn slipped through the cracks in the shelter's metal walls, casting thin lines across the dusty floor. Sarah Helene opened her eyes, unsure for a moment where she was. Then the faint hum of the heater reminded her she wasn't outside in the cold. She was in the human's shelter. Laro was still sleeping beside her, wrapped in the thick blanket Ethan had given them, his face finally free from the tight, shivering expression he had worn for weeks. Ethan was already awake, moving around the room with quiet steps. He was checking the heater, adjusting knobs, and stacking crates into a neater pile when he noticed her watching. He gave a small nod. "Morning," he said, his voice low but not unfriendly. She sat up slowly, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "You didn't sleep," she said softly. "Not much," he admitted. "The wind makes a lot of noise in this place, and I had to keep an ear out." His tone carried an unspoken warning, and she understood he meant for trouble, not just the weather. The air in the room was warmer now, enough to make her fingers tingle as blood returned to them. Ethan poured water from a canister into a small pot and set it over the heating unit. Soon, the faint scent of tea leaves began to drift through the shelter. Laro stirred, rubbing his eyes, when he saw the steam rising from the pot. His expression lit up. Ethan poured him a cup, handing it over carefully. "Careful, it's hot," he said. Laro took a sip, his small hands gripping the metal cup like it was a treasure. Sarah Helene watched the scene with a strange feeling in her chest. This was such a simple thing: warm tea, a roof, a moment of peace, but it felt like something she had been chasing for years. Still, she reminded herself not to relax too much. Warmth could be taken away just as quickly as it was given. "I'll go out later," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "Need to trade for some supplies." She hesitated, then asked, "Do you want me to help?" His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in thought. "You can. But the market's not friendly to strangers," he warned. She gave a small, bitter smile. "I'm used to that." When they stepped outside later that morning, the cold bit at their faces, but it was easier to bear knowing they had a warm place to return to. The market was busy despite the frost, with traders shouting prices and customers wrapped in thick cloaks moving between stalls. Ethan moved with purpose, bartering for food, spare parts, and fuel cells. Sarah Lynn kept close, holding Laro's hand tightly. It didn't take long for her to notice the stares, Whispers followed them, some pointed at her, others at Ethan. Their expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. At one stall, the merchant, a broad-shouldered alien with dark scales, leaned closer to Ethan and spoke in a low voice. "You're drawing attention." Ethan didn't look up from the pile of goods he was inspecting. "Not my problem," he said flatly. The merchant snorted. "It will be." Sarah Helene kept her head down, feeling the weight of every gaze. On her back, by the time they returned to the shelter, her nerves were raw. Ethan set the supplies down and locked the door. "They're already talking," he said. "They think you're trouble." She flinched at his words. "I didn't ask you to bring me in," she replied quickly, her voice trembling between anger and shame. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "I know," he said finally, "but I'm not throwing you out, so stop thinking I will." The rest of the day passed quietly. Ethan worked on repairing a small generator in the corner, while Laro sat nearby, watching every move. Occasionally, Ethan explained what he was doing, showing the boy how to hold tools and test circuits. Sarah Helene sat by the heater, mending a tear in Laro's shirt. Every so often, her eyes would drift to Ethan. He was focused, steady, and unlike anyone she had known before, he didn't pity her, and he didn't treat her like she was broken. It was unsettling, but in a way that made her want to believe in it. That night, Ethan made a simple stew from dried vegetables and grain. The warmth of the meal filled the small shelter. Laro laughed quietly at something Ethan said, the sound so rare that it caught Sarah Helene off guard. For a moment, she forgot the whispers, the cold streets, and the years of loneliness. For a moment, it felt like a home, but as the wind rose again outside, rattling the metal walls, she knew this peace was fragile. There were still people out there who would rather see her freeze than let her stay. And sooner or later, they would come knocking. For now, though. The heater hummed steadily. The stew was warm in her stomach, and the human stranger sat across from her, quietly making sure the fire of life didn't fade from her and her son. Asterisk. The next morning, the cold air was sharper, the kind that made breathing feel like swallowing shards of glass. Ethan pulled on his heavy coat, checking the pockets for trade tokens. "We'll need more supplies," he said. "The heater burns fuel faster in this weather." Sarah Helene nodded, wrapping Laro in the thick blanket before they stepped outside. The streets were quieter than yesterday, but the market's noise still echoed from a distance, voices calling out prices. Carts clattering over frost-covered stones when they reached the market. Sarah Helene felt the change immediately. The stares were no longer just curious, they were colder, sharper. She could feel the weight of eyes following her every step. Ethan ignored it, walking straight to a merchant selling food. But as Sarah Helene stood beside him, she heard it, low voices behind her. "That's the widow," one said. "The cursed one," another replied. A third voice laughed. "And now she's with a human?" How fitting. Her hands tightened around the edge of the blanket. She wanted to turn, to tell them they knew nothing about her. But years of surviving on the streets had taught her that speaking back only made things worse. Ethan finished his trade and moved to the next stall. As they passed a group of vendors, one muttered just loud enough for Ethan to hear, "Careful, human, that one brings bad luck." Ethan stopped for a moment, his gaze cutting through the man. "Bad luck doesn't freeze children in the street," he said calmly. The vendor scoffed but said nothing more. Sarah Helene followed him, her steps quick to keep up. "You shouldn't offend me," she whispered. "Why not?" he asked without looking at her. "Because it will only make them hate you too," she replied. Ethan shrugged. "I'm already not their favorite." It was the truth. Humans were rare here, and those who stayed were usually treated with suspicion. Ethan didn't seem to care. But Sarah Helene knew that whispers could grow into something far more dangerous. They reached the far end of the market, where the stalls were smaller and the air colder. Here, the people looked poorer, their clothes patched and worn. One elderly alien woman sold small bundles of dried herbs, her hands shaking from the cold. Sarah Helene bought a small bundle using one of the trade tokens Ethan had given her. The woman's eyes softened for a moment as she pressed the herbs into her palm, but then her gaze flicked to Ethan, and she quickly looked away. Even kindness here came with caution. On the way back, the tension grew thicker. A group of local enforcers in black armor stood near the market exit, their helmets reflecting the pale light. One of them stepped forward as Ethan and Sarah Helene approached. "Human," the enforcer said, his tone heavy with authority. "You've been seen with her." He nodded toward Sarah Helene. "So?" Ethan replied evenly. "She's not welcome in the city," the enforcer continued. "She's been cast out, and anyone who shelters her will answer for it." Sarah Helene's stomach twisted. Ethan stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "She's with me now, and you're not taking her." The enforcer tilted his head, as if amused. "For now," he said. Before stepping aside, they walked the rest of the way in silence. When they reached the shelter, Ethan locked the door and dropped the supplies on the table. "They'll be back," he said quietly. Sarah Helene lowered her head. "You should have left me there." "I don't want to bring you trouble." Ethan stared at her for a moment, then shook his head. "I've seen enough people turn away from someone who needed help," he said. "I'm not adding my name to that list." Laro came over, holding the blanket tightly, his small face worried. Sarah Helene forced a smile for him. Though her heart felt heavy, Ethan busied himself with sorting the supplies. The heater hummed softly, filling the room with warmth. But Sarah Helene couldn't shake the chill in her chest. She knew the whispers were only the beginning. Once the city decided someone was a problem, they didn't just ignore them, they removed them. That night, as the wind pressed against the walls and the heater glowed in the dark, Sarah Helene lay awake. She could hear faint footsteps outside the shelter, stopping and starting. It could have been nothing, or it could have been the beginning of something she feared far more than the cold. And while Ethan seemed calm, she could see the way his hand rested close to the tool belt at his side. As if he was ready for the moment, someone decided to knock on the door, not to ask, but to take. The morning after the whispers in the market, the air inside the shelter felt heavier. Ethan was quieter than usual, moving around the room with sharp, deliberate movements. Sarah Helene could tell he was thinking about the enforcers. They had seen her face, heard her name, and that meant trouble was already on its way. Laro sat on the floor with a small piece of scrap metal Ethan had given him, pretending it was a toy ship. His laughter was soft, but even that sound felt like it didn't belong in a city that was waiting to shut them out. Ethan finished packing a small bag of supplies. "I'm going to the docks," he said. "Need to check the cargo I brought in last month." Sarah Helene knew what he meant. He was making sure they had a way to leave if they had to. "I'll come with you," she offered. He shook his head. "No. If they see us together again, it'll only make it worse." The words stung, but she understood. He wasn't leaving her behind because he didn't want her. He was leaving her because he wanted her safe. When Ethan left, the shelter felt too quiet. The sound of the heater wasn't enough to fill the emptiness. Sarah Helene tried to focus on mending Laro's torn scarf, but her mind kept drifting to the enforcer's cold voices. She thought she heard footsteps outside and froze, listening. The sound faded, but her heart kept racing. By the time Ethan returned, his coat carried the smell of the dock salt, oil, and the faint scent of starship fuel. "They've been asking about me," he said without looking up, as he locked the door behind him. "Who?" she asked. "The enforcers," he replied, "and a few merchants. They want to know why I'm keeping you." Sarah Helene's hands tightened around the scarf. "They think I'm a problem," she said quietly. Ethan met her eyes. "You're not the problem." "They are." That evening, just as the sun dipped behind the frozen towers of the city, someone banged on the door. The sound was loud and sharp, making Laro jump. Ethan moved quickly, motioning for Sarah Helene to take the boy to the back corner. When he opened the door, 3 enforcers stood there, their armor black and polished. One of them stepped forward. "You have no permit to house a vagrant," he said, his voice echoing under his helmet. "She's not a vagrant," Ethan replied evenly. "She's under my protection." "That protection is against city law," the enforcer said. "Then your law is broken," Ethan shot back. The enforcers stepped closer. Sarah Helene could see Ethan's hand twitch near his belt, ready to grab a tool or weapon if needed. But after a tense moment, the leader tilted his head. "You have until the next moon cycle to get rid of her," he said. "If she's still here, we take her and the child." Ethan's jaw tightened. "If you try, you'll regret it." The enforcer gave a cold, mechanical laugh before turning away. The other two followed, their boots crunching against the frozen ground. Ethan shut the door and turned the lock. His face was calm, but his eyes burned. "They won't wait for the next moon cycle," he said. "They'll come sooner." Sarah Helene pulled Laro close, her mind spinning. "They'll take him from me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Not while I'm alive," Ethan said, his tone like steel. From that night, Ethan began working on the ship every spare moment. He didn't say it, but she knew he was preparing for an escape. Sarah Lynn helped where she could, holding lights, carrying tools, keeping watch. Each day, the tension outside the shelter grew. Merchants no longer greeted Ethan. Neighbors turned their backs, and sometimes in the distance, she thought she saw the glint of black armor watching from the shadows. One afternoon, while Ethan was tightening a fuel line inside the ship, Sarah Helene asked, "Why are you doing this for us? You could leave alone and be safe." Ethan didn't look up from his work. "I've been alone before," he said. "Didn't like it. And I'm not going to watch someone else freeze or starve just because a city decided she wasn't worth keeping alive." She didn't know what to say. The words sat heavy in her chest, warm in a way she wasn't used to. That night, they heard voices outside again, not just one or two this time. There were several. Ethan moved to the window, peering through the narrow slit. "They're closer than before," he murmured. Sarah Helene felt her heartbeat pound in her ears. He turned to her, his expression firm. "We might have to leave soon." The thought terrified her. Leaving meant risk, but staying meant certain danger. She looked at Laro, asleep in the corner, clutching the blanket tightly. She had already lost everything once. She wasn't going to lose him too. And as the wind carried the sound of boots crunching in the snow outside, Sarah Lynn knew the time for choices was almost over. The threat wasn't just growing, it was coming straight for them. The night before the escape was colder than any they had faced. The wind screamed against the metal walls of the shelter, carrying with it the faint sound of voices. Ethan paced the floor, checking and rechecking the small bag of supplies, food packs, water, a few tools, and extra fuel cells. Sarah Helene sat in the corner, holding Laro as he slept. She didn't need to ask what Ethan was thinking. She could see it in his face. They couldn't wait for the enforcers to come. They had to leave, and they had to do it now. Just before dawn, Ethan woke her with a quiet shake of the shoulder. "It's time," he whispered. She rose carefully, not waking Laro until the last moment. The boy's eyes opened gradually, but when he saw the determination in Ethan's expression, he didn't ask questions. They wrapped themselves in layers of cloth and moved quickly. The streets were empty at this hour, the frost on the ground crunching under their feet. Ethan led them through back alleys, avoiding the main roads where patrols usually passed. They reached the edge of the docks, where the air smelled of oil and frozen metal. Ethan's ship sat in a shadowed corner, its hull scarred from old journeys. It wasn't much to look at, but it was fueled and ready. Sarah Helene helped Laro up the loading ramp, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds. Her nerves were sharp, every sound making her flinch. Ethan moved fast, unlocking the hatch and ushering them inside. The interior of the ship was small but warmer than outside. Ethan strapped Laro into a seat near the control panel and handed Sarah Helene a safety belt. "Stay buckled no matter what happens," he said. She nodded, gripping the armrests tightly. Ethan powered up the ship, the engines rumbling low at first. Then growing louder, the sound seemed too loud, too easy to notice in the stillness of dawn, and then, it happened. Shouts echoed from the docks. Figures in black armor emerged from the shadows. Weapons in hand. They found us. Sarah Lynn gasped. Ethan's hands moved over the controls faster, flipping switches and pulling levers. The engines roared to life, heat shimmering from the exhaust. "Hold on," he said, his voice steady but urgent. Blaster fire lit the air outside, bolts of red and blue striking the dock plates. Ethan swung the ship's nose toward the sky. Metal groaning under the sudden strain, one bolt slammed into the hull, sending a loud vibration through the cabin. Laro cried out, clinging to the straps. Sarah Lynn's heart pounded. Her eyes locked on the docking ramp still lowering. "Ethan!" She shouted, "I know!" He replied, hitting the control to seal it shut. The ship lifted from the ground, but more armored figures rushed in. Firing at the landing gear, Ethan twisted the controls, sending the ship in a sharp upward climb. The sudden movement pressed them into their seats, the city below shrinking fast. Through the small window, Sarah Lynn saw the cold, gleaming towers fading into the distance. But she also saw a patrol skimmer rising to follow them, its lights flashing like a warning. "They're chasing us," she said. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then we make sure they can't catch us." He pushed the throttle forward, the engines screaming as the ship broke through the thin layer of clouds. The skimmer fired, a shot grazing the wing. Ethan swore under his breath, banking hard to the left. The maneuver sent Sarah Lynn's stomach lurching, but it also made the skimmer overshoot its path. Ethan seized the chance. Diving into the thicker cloud cover, the world outside turned to swirling white mist, hiding them from view for a few moments. There was only the sound of the engines and Laro's quiet sobs. Ethan kept the ship steady, eyes scanning the sensors. Finally, he exhaled. "We lost them." Sarah Lynn's shoulders sagged in relief, but the tension in her chest didn't fully leave. They had escaped the city, but they weren't free yet. Ethan adjusted the controls and set the course. "Next stop, human colony world," he said. "How far?" she asked. "Far enough that they won't follow. If we make it without trouble," he replied. Sarah Lynn looked out at the endless stretch of stars beyond the viewport. She had never left her planet before. The idea of going somewhere new was both terrifying and hopeful. Laro, still shaken, reached for her hand, and she held it tightly. She glanced at Ethan, who was focused on the stars ahead. He had risked everything to get them out, and though she didn't fully understand why, she knew one thing for certain: she owed him her life. The ship sailed on through the dark, the city, the cold streets, and the enforcers faded into the distance. But Sarah Lynn knew they would always carry the memory of this night, the night when a human stranger chose to fight for them, the night they left danger behind and stepped into the unknown. The human colony world was nothing like Sarah Lynn had imagined. When the ship broke through the last layer of clouds, her eyes widened at the sight below. Rolling green hills stretched as far as she could see, dotted with small houses that smoked gently from stone chimneys. The air looked warm here, painted in gold by the rising sun. It was not like the cold, steel-colored skies of her home. It felt alive. Laro pressed his face against the viewport, his small hands leaving faint marks on the glass. "Is this where we live now?" he asked in a voice filled with wonder. Ethan glanced at him with a faint smile. "If you want it to be." The ship landed on the edge of a quiet settlement. The ground was soft underfoot, the scent of grass rich after so many weeks of frost and metal. A few humans from the colony came to greet Ethan, their expressions curious but friendly. They did not stare at Sarah Lynn with suspicion, and no one whispered about her as she passed. For the first time in a long time, she felt invisible in the best way, not ignored, but accepted. Ethan spoke with the settlement leader, a tall woman with sun-browned skin. Within minutes, the woman offered them a small house on the outskirts of the village. "It's not much," she said kindly, "but it's warm, and it's yours if you want it." When they stepped inside, Sarah Lynn's breath caught. The house was small but full of light, with 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and a window that looked out over a green valley. Laro ran to the window instantly, laughing as he pointed at a flock of small, bright birds passing by. Sarah Lynn touched the smooth wooden walls, feeling their warmth under her fingers. It was not the fine home she once had, but it was more than she had ever dreamed of finding. Again, Ethan dropped the bags by the door and set to work starting a fire in the hearth. Within minutes, the flames crackled, filling the room with a gentle heat. Sarah Lynn stood there, watching him. "You've given us more than a home," she said softly. He looked up from the fire, his expression calm. "You needed a place where no one could take you away," he replied. She nodded, her throat tight. There was more she wanted to say, but the words caught in her chest. Instead, she busied herself with unpacking, placing the few belongings they had on the shelves. Over the next few days, life began to settle into something almost normal. Ethan repaired the roof where the rain leaked in, while Sarah Lynn learned the paths through the village. The humans here traded fairly, never turning her away. Laro made friends quickly, his laughter often echoing from the fields where he played. Each night, they gathered by the fire, eating simple meals and talking about the day. It was a rhythm she had thought she would never know again, but even in this peace, Sarah Lynn could not forget what they had fled. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the hills in red and gold, she stood outside. The wind was warm on her face, carrying the scent of flowers. Ethan joined her, leaning on the doorway. "You're thinking about them," he said. She nodded. "Do you think they'll come after us?" Ethan's eyes scanned the horizon, then returned to her. "They have to cross half the galaxy. And even if they tried, they'd find me waiting." Something in his voice made her believe him completely. That night, after Laro had gone to bed, Sarah Lynn sat by the fire. She thought about the first night they met, how cold and hopeless it had been. And now here she was, sitting in a warm room, safe, with her son asleep in the next room. Ethan sat across from her, quietly carving a piece of wood into the shape of a bird. When he finished, he handed it to her. "For the window," he said. She turned it over in her hands, the small wooden bird smooth and carefully made. "It's beautiful," she whispered. His eyes met hers, steady and warm. "You deserve something beautiful," he said. In that moment, Sarah Lynn realized something she had been afraid to admit. The warmth she had found here wasn't just in the fire, or the sunlight, or the safety of the house. It was in the way Ethan spoke to her, the way he looked at Laro like he mattered, the way he had chosen to stand beside her when no one else would. This was the warmth she had been searching for all along. The days turned into weeks, and the green hills became their home. Sarah Lynn tended a small garden behind the house, growing herbs and vegetables. Laro learned to fish in the nearby stream, often bringing home more water on his clothes than in his bucket. Ethan kept the house in good repair, and when the evenings grew cooler, he would sit by the fire with them, telling quiet stories of his travels. And sometimes, when Sarah Lynn caught his eye, he would give her a small knowing smile, one that said they had both come through the cold together. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Laro curled up by the fire and fell asleep. Sarah Lynn looked at Ethan, her voice low. "No home wanted a widow like me, human. But all I wanted was warmth, and you gave it." Ethan didn't answer right away. He reached over, placing his hand gently over hers. "You gave me something too," he said. "A reason to stay." And as the fire crackled softly in the quiet house, Sarah Lynn knew this was no longer just a shelter. It was a home. Their home.